Hey, what's going on, everybody? Back with another top 5 video. I'll be short and sweet. I hope you enjoy the video. Top 5 most expensive funerals. It's a list of 1 to 5. 1 doesn't mean the most, and 5 doesn't mean the least. It's just a cumulative list. So here it is. I hope you enjoy. Ronald Reagan passed away on June the 5th of 2004 at the age of 93 after having Alzheimer's disease for nearly a decade. After Reagan's death, his body was taken from his Bel Air home to the Kingsley and Gates Funeral Home in Santa Monica, California, to prepare the body for burial. On June the 7th, Reagan's casket was transported by hearse and displayed at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in California. Reagan's remains were presented in a Marcellus masterpiece model purchased from the funeral home for $13,000, which is over $20,000 in 2022 money. It was carried by a military honor guard representing all branches of the United States Armed Forces. Nancy Reagan and her family approached the casket, where Nancy laid her head on it. After the family left, the doors of the presidential library opened, and the public began filling in at a rate of 2,000 an hour throughout the night. On June the 9th, Reagan's casket was removed from the library and driven in a motorcade to Oxnard. The two Boeing 747s, which usually serves the president as Air Force One, arrived to transport the casket to Washington. Just before she boarded the VCA 25A presidential aircraft, Nancy Reagan waved to the crowd with her military escort. The plane lifted off at about 9:40 a.m. Pacific. Events in the Capitol began when Reagan's casket arrived at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. It was removed from the plane, driven by hearse in a procession through Maryland and Virginia suburbs and the nation's capital, across the Arlington Memorial Bridge, and onto Constitution Avenue. Within sight of the White House, the hearse halted and Reagan's body was transferred to a horse-drawn caisson for the procession down Constitution Avenue to Capitol Hill. The caisson stopped when it arrived at Capitol Hill. Military units removed it, and "Hail to the Chief" was played amidst a 21-gun salute. The casket was carried up the west front steps of the Capitol, mainly because Reagan was first inaugurated there, and he wanted to face west towards California. When the casket reached the top of the steps, Nancy Reagan and her military escort met it. As the casket passed them, Nancy momentarily pulled away from her escort, reached out, and touched this casket. The casket was placed under the rotunda where it lay in state. After 34 hours of lying in state, the doors of the Capitol were closed to the public, and Nancy Reagan was escorted in, where she had a moment alone with the casket. A military honor guard entered and carried it down the west steps of the Capitol. After it was placed in a hearse, the motorcade departed on the 5-mile trip to the Washington National Cathedral, where the state funeral service was to be held. The motorcade arrived at the cathedral, and Reagan's casket was removed. The casket then carried down the aisle. The Reagan family followed, and Nancy Reagan was escorted to her seat by then-President Bush. After the service, the casket was driven to Andrews Air Force Base. Eulogies finished and the service over. The Air Force Band of the Golden West played "Four Ruffles and Flourishes," and the casket was moved to its gravesite. There, burial rites were given, followed by the last 21-gun salute. At that time, 4 Navy F-A-18 fighter jets flew over in a missing man formation, and the flag that flew over the Capitol during President Reagan's 1981 inauguration was folded by the honor guard and was presented to Nancy Reagan by Captain James Simmons. After Nancy Reagan accepted the flag, she approached the casket and spent several minutes patting and stroking it. She laid her head down on the casket before breaking down and crying. When she cried, she kissed the casket and said, "I love you." Princess Diana's 1997 funeral cost between 3 and 5 million pounds, or somewhere between 7 to 8 million when adjusted for inflation today. The funeral of Diana, Princess of Wales, started on Saturday, the 6th of September in 97. The coffin was carried from the palace on a gun carriage by raiders of the King's Troop and escorted by mounted police along Hyde Park to St. James's Place, where Diana's body had remained for 5 days before being taken to Kensington Palace. However, the event was not a state funeral. Instead, it was a royal ceremonial funeral that included royal pageantry. A large display of flowers was installed at the gates of Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace. 8 members of the Welsh Guard accompanied Diana's coffin, draped in the royal standard. There was also a letter from Prince Harry on her coffin addressed to Mummy The coffin then passed Buckingham Palace, where members of the royal family were waiting outside. Queen Elizabeth II bowed her head as it went by. More than 1 million people lined the streets of London. The ceremony at Westminster Abbey lasted 1 hour and 10 minutes. During the service, Elton John sang a 1997 rendition of Candle in the Wind with new lyrics written as a tribute to Diana. The burial occurred privately later the same day. Diana's former husband, sons, mother, siblings, a close friend, and a clergyman were present. A set of rosary beads were placed in her hands, a gift she had received from Mother Teresa, who died the same week as Diana. In her hands was also a photograph of her sons, a photo which traveled around with her and had been found in her handbag. The original plan was for Diana to be buried in the Spencer family vault at the local church in nearby Great Brighton, but Lord Spencer said that he was concerned about the public safety and security and the onslaught of visitors that might overwhelm the town. He decided that Diana would be buried where her grave could be easily cared for and visited in privacy by William, Harry, and other Spencer relatives. Oh, hey, I'm glad you're still watching the video. Please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoy the content, and share it. Getting the word out helps the channel grow, and I really do appreciate it. And let me market my brand by saying, hey, we have a whole page you can go to get shirts and hats and all kinds of things, and we've got our Liquid IV sponsorship that'll be down in the description. So if you drink that stuff like I do, it's pretty good, and you get 15% off, and I get something out of it. Yeah. So with all of my crap out of the way, let's finish the rest of the video. On the evening of Tuesday, August the 16th, 1977, Presley was scheduled to fly out of Memphis to begin another tour. That afternoon, Ginger Aldine discovered him in an unresponsive state on the bathroom floor of his Graceland mansion. Attempts to revive him failed, and he was pronounced dead at Baptist Memorial Hospital. Thousands of people gathered outside Graceland to view the open casket. One of Presley's cousins, Billy Mann, accepted $18,000, equivalent to $88,000 in 2022, to secretly photograph the body. The picture appeared on the cover of National Enquirer's biggest selling issue ever. Presley's funeral was held at Graceland on Thursday, August 18th. Outside the gates, a car plowed into a group of fans, killing 2 young women and critically injuring a third. About 80,000 people lined the procession route to Forest Hill Cemetery, where Presley was buried, following an attempt to steal Presley's body in late August. The remains of both Presley and his mother were exhumed and reburied in Graceland's Meditation Garden on October 2nd. The funeral of Pope John Paul II was held on April the 8th, 2005. Pope John Paul's funeral brought together what was at the time the single largest gathering in history of heads of state outside the United Nations. 4 kings, 5 queens, and at least 70 presidents and prime ministers, and more than 14 leaders of other religions attended. It is likely to have been one of the largest single gatherings of Christianity in history, with numbers estimated in excess of 4 million mourners gathering in Rome alone. An underground grotto beside the former shrine of the now glass entombed and preserved body of Pope John the 23rd was chosen for the interment of John Paul II. He was lowered into a tomb that had been prepared following the transfer of John the 23rd's remains from the grotto to the main floor of the basilica. The vault had originally held John the 23rd's body had been removed so the new tomb could be built. The College of Cardinals decided to keep John Paul II beneath the altar of St. Peter's Basilica. Cardinal Martinez of the Roman Church then presided over the rite of interment. It was a private service witnessed only by the highest-ranking members of the College of Cardinals. As is custom, Pope John Paul II was entombed in 3 nested coffins. The unified coffin was lowered into the ground, as the Pope requested, and covered with a plain stone slab featuring his name. On the 8th of September 2022, the longest reigning British monarch died at the age of 96 in Scotland. The death certificate, which Anne, the Princess Royal, signed as the informant, stated the cause of death as old age. There is no recent precedent for the cost of a state funeral. It's been 70 years since the UK buried a sovereign, and 57 years since its last state funeral for Winston Churchill. The Queen's death in Scotland meant that Operation Unicorn was the first part of Operation London Bridge to take effect. The Queen's body was transported to Edinburgh, where ceremonial events took place, before her body was transported to London for the state funeral. On the 13th of September, the Queen's coffin was taken by hearse to Edinburgh Airport and flown to RAF Northolt on a Royal Air Force C-17 Globemaster, accompanied by Princess Anne and Timothy Lawrence. During the journey, the Scottish version of the royal standard that draped the coffin was replaced by the royal standard that is used in the remainder of the United Kingdom. Upon the Queen's arrival in London, she was transported to Buckingham Palace before being moved to Westminster Hall the following day for her lying in state before the state funeral. The Queen's coffin was taken in a military procession from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Hall on a horse-drawn carriage of the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery. The Queen lay in state in Westminster Hall. The coffin was guarded by members of both the Sovereign's bodyguard and the Household Division. An estimated 250,000 members of the public filed past the coffin. On September 19th, the Queen's coffin was moved from Westminster Hall to Westminster Abbey on the state gun carriage of the Royal Navy. The carriage was drawn by Royal Navy sailors, known as naval ratings, maintaining a tradition which began at the state funeral of Queen Victoria. A wreath with foliage cut from the gardens of Buckingham Palace, Highgrove House, and Clarence House was placed on the coffin, together with a note from the King which read, "In loving and devoted memory, Charles R." Two processions followed the service. The first was from Westminster Abbey to Wellington Arch, where the Queen's coffin was placed in the state hearse. From there it was transported to Windsor, where the second procession took through Windsor Great Park. The procession in London included around 3,000 military personnel stretching for over a mile. Around 1 million people lined the streets of central London to watch the event. Once the coffin arrived at Windsor, where a final procession involving 1,000 military personnel took place down the long walk to St. George's Chapel. Around 97,000 people lined the route. At the end of the procession, the coffin was taken to St. George's Chapel via the West Steps with a guard of honor formed by the 1st Battalion. The committal service consisted of 800 guests, largely made up of royal household and staff from the Queen's private estates, but also included the royal family, governors, general, and prime ministers from the Commonwealth realms, and members of foreign royal houses. Neither the end of the service, the imperial state crown, orb, and scepter were removed from the coffin and placed on the altar. The Queen was interred in a private service in the crypt of the King George VI Memorial Chapel within St. George's Chapel. She lies alongside her parents, King George VI, and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and the ashes of her sister, Princess Margaret. Her husband, Prince Philip, is also buried beside her. Well, you made it to the end, and I can't thank you enough. Thank you for watching this. It really does mean a lot. I put time and effort and work into these things, and when you guys watch it and the videos do well, I can't thank you enough. I'm glad you enjoy the content, and by doing all the liking and the sharing and stuff, it puts it in the algorithm, and that's the only reason I bring it up, just so we can make the channel grow, so we can go do, I say we, as in you and I, get to go do these things because it's you that drives the channel. And thank you for watching. I'll see you on the next one.